Good afternoon and welcome. Our webinar today is U.S. Cybersecurity Policy for Data Breach, Ransomware, and Supply Chain. What's working, what isn't, and how to fix it. I'm Roslyn Layton, Program Chair for TPRC. If you're new to our organization, the Telecom Policy Research Conference is an annual event which facilitates the multidisciplinary discussion of information and telecommunications policy, now for 49 years. Throughout today's discussion, please follow us on Twitter and tweet your comments to TPRC Tweets. Today, we're delighted to have an opening keynote, a panel, and a closing keynote. So without further ado, we'll get started. We are honored to welcome Carole House, Director of Cybersecurity and Secure Digital Innovation at the National Security Council. Ms. House is a veteran who served in the U.S. Army in Afghanistan in combat and intelligence roles. She earned a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown and has performed policy analysis for the Senate Committee for Homeland Security, the Office of Management and Budget, and the U.S. Treasury. In her role, Ms. House advises the President and coordinates government agencies on cybersecurity. Ms. House, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roslyn, and thanks to TPRC for allowing me to come speak with you all today. So today I'm going to speak to a couple of key priority issues for the administration. First, really focusing on 5G security and the criticality of an open and diverse marketplace and the focus on cybersecurity integrated into 5G supply chains. And then I'm going to focus on a key priority threat that the administration is working across departments and agencies for a whole of government approach to address the threat of ransomware. So first on 5G, the Biden administration views 5G as a critically high priority. The United States advocates for a vibrant digital economy worldwide that enables all citizens to benefit from the promise of fifth and future generation wireless networks. 5G is going to be transformative, or it is already transformative. We'll touch every aspect of our lives, including critical infrastructure, including transportation, electrical distribution, and provision of other types of services that impact citizens every day, including healthcare and many more. So the stakes for securing these networks could not be higher, and the administration recognizes that. 5G security can only be addressed through an effective global approach. We are committed to engaging on this topic with allies, partners, and industry worldwide to promote open, interoperable, reliable, and secure information and communications technology infrastructure. This will enable not only collective response and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, but will also facilitate efforts to meet the security challenges of the future. But countries and citizens need to be able to trust that 5G equipment and software will not introduce risks that will threaten the national security, personal privacy, or human rights of our country. So trust cannot exist where information and communications technology and services providers are subject to authoritarian governments that subject domestic companies to broad intelligence and national security laws and lack an independent judiciary and rule of law to protect companies and consumers. So national measures must be crafted to mitigate significant security risks from high-risk suppliers, regardless of national origin, by precluding such suppliers from providing equipment, software, and services to 5G network infrastructure. We are working with our allies and partners to support a more vibrant and diverse supply chain of trustworthy telecommunications, equipment, and services. So this includes a support for open and interoperable approaches like Open RAN, technologies that have the potential to enhance and promote market competition, as well as lower costs and improve security. So we encourage you to join us in our support of 5G trust principles and vendor diversity in telecommunications ecosystems. Next, I mentioned that there's a priority threat in the cybersecurity landscape that the administration is seeking to address aggressively. The ransomware threat is an urgent, complex national security threat that's been on the rise for years. And it's not just happening in America, but around the world, including targeting of critical infrastructure abroad and inside of the United States. This is a top priority for the administration, and you can see that from the actions that we're taking. We do want to stress that the federal government can cannot take this action alone. It's why we're working with international partners and with the private sector. The Deputy National Security Advisor, Ann Neuberger, for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, she's written an open memo to business leaders recently, speaking to some of the measures that industry can implement to better secure their systems. In this open letter, she points to the need for backing up data and systems, ensuring proper configuration, regularly testing your systems, and keeping those backups offline, as well as other measures like updating and patching systems promptly, testing incident response plans, and segmenting networks. So this open letter to industry CEOs was highlighting some of the key measures that industry can play and fulfilling their responsibility for helping to ensure security of their networks. And then the government is also taking a lot of key efforts and initiatives as part of a holistic, whole of government ransomware strategy to address this increased threat. A couple of priority lines of effort for us include disrupting ransomware infrastructure and actors through working closely with industry, building an international coalition to hold countries accountable for ransomware actors and the activity that's emanating from within their borders. We're expanding cryptocurrency analysis to be able to find and pursue criminal transactions and associated proceeds, and we're reviewing the US government's ransomware payment policies. We'll continue to work with allies and partners to focus on resilience, as well as to hold accountable these illicit actors and to more effectively deter this activity and to reduce the threat posed by ransomware. It has to be a whole of nation approach, including partnerships with the private sector, both in the capabilities that they can provide, the visibility that they can provide, and through being able to help them defend their systems against these actors. So on a couple of other initiatives that the administration has underway to help industry better secure their networks. We issued a cybersecurity executive order, which pointed out steps that governments, including municipalities, could take, including multi-factor authentication and encryption, EDR, logging, secure cloud, and security operations center maturation. And under our executive order, we also pointed to the importance of a cyber incident review board that may be able to convene following significant cyber incidents to analyze what happens and then make concrete recommendations on how to move forward. So I just wanted to give a little bit of this upfront context to the discussions that you will be having. Thank you so much for this opportunity. The Biden administration is very committed to cybersecurity. And again, thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you, Ms. House, for those comments. That's very insightful, informative, and certainly tees up our discussion today. Now let's go to our panel. First, we have Josephine Wolff. She's a professor of cybersecurity at Tufts University and the author of "You'll See This Message When It's Too Late: The Legal and Economic Aftermath of Cybersecurity Breaches." We have Tom Vartanian, an expert in financial law and a former banking regulator. His new book is just out, 200 Years of American Financial Panics, Crashes, Recessions, Depressions, and the Technology That Will Change It All. You can see it's auspiciously displayed in his background, just so you know. So I'm excited for his next book, Cyber War, which is in the works. And we also have Karl Grindal, a newly minted PhD in cybersecurity studies from the Georgia Institute of Technology. Karl will present on his research on data breaches this fall at our TPRC conference. So welcome to our panel today. In her remarks, Ms. House, she made a number of points. She focused largely on 5G security supply chain and what the Biden administration is going to do on ransomware. She's talked about open digital economy, the Clean Network Initiative, maybe restricting some vendors that are not considered trustworthy, and then doing international partnerships. So what about you, panel? What's your reaction to some of the remarks that she's made? Josephine, why don't we start with you?
So I think my reaction is that this is a strategy that we're really still seeing take shape. That all of the things that were just said are things that were fairly light on specifics, and that's been true, not just of those remarks, but of the policy approach in general from the Biden administration. I think there are a couple specific things that we've seen that are a little bit interesting. One is certainly the recovery of part of the ransomware that was paid by Colonial Pipeline, and she alluded to that in the cryptocurrency policing efforts. So I think one really interesting thing to watch is going to be how repeatable that is, right? How much criminals are able to learn from that particular incident and do a better job of obfuscating and making their cryptocurrency wallets harder to access, or whether that's actually going to be something that law enforcement is able to continue doing with some regularity. I think that could make a big difference. I think she alluded to, we're going to look at the ransom payment policies, whether there should be sort of more pressure not to pay these ransoms, which I think would be a terrific thing. Though again, we haven't seen it yet. We're still sort of seeing people say we're going to look at this. We've seen some action sort of specifically in the aftermath of the Colonial pipeline incident around critical infrastructure, and I would say around pipeline companies specifically, towards requiring them to report more different types of incidents. And again, I would say these are positive changes, but very, very incremental ones. So I think the interesting thing to watch from my perspective is sort of, is this going to pick up a little bit more momentum over the course of the next year or so? Are we going to see more and more of these changes and perhaps even sort of more aggressive changes? Or is this something that's sort of top of mind right now because there have been a couple really high profile incidents, but perhaps going to lose some steam, as I would say under past administrations we've sometimes seen happen?
That's a great point. Other panelists, any thoughts?
Yeah, Roslyn, this is Tom. I guess my reaction is that I've been waiting for an administration to take cybersecurity seriously for 25 years. In a very large measure, the Clinton administration nailed it. I mean, they understood the problems. They identified the problems. They began to designate critical infrastructures in 1996 in an executive order by President Clinton. And the problem has been, for 25 years, we've sort of been treading water when the private sector and the government have been staring at each other, waiting for the other to sort of take the lead. And here we are now, 25 years later, probably no better off than we were in terms of cybersecurity. And there's a lot of reasons for that, I think. I think the market, unfortunately, rewards innovation and doesn't penalize insecurity. And so this rush to the market to get software and hardware out that may not be ready for prime time. But at the end of the day, if you look at the last 25 years, and I have read every executive order, every directive, every congressional report, every GAO report, every NSA, every report you can find over the last 25 years, and it's just repetition over repetition over repetition, saying, here are the issues, here's what we have to do, and we never get there, right? So in 2021, we're sitting here with an internet and cybersecurity issues that we all know may prevent water from flowing today, may cause the collapse of the power grid, may see ATMs stop spitting out money, and gas, meat, and chip distribution coming to a halt. And the problem is now we're 25 years down the line, and we've wasted 25 years in terms of getting to where we need to be in terms of security.
Well, I think those are great comments. Josephine, you're saying that, we've heard a lot of these things before. You're waiting to see how it will play out. And Tom, from your perspective, not much has been done. So maybe in some ways the Biden administration starts out in a better place if the expectations are sort of low from the past. Well, I guess it remains to be seen. But let's continue. I'm going to pivot over to you, Karl, because you're deep in the numbers on data breaches. And in your research, you want to know whether these policy interventions actually reduce the frequency of data breaches. So maybe why don't you begin by telling us how do you define the data breach and what policymakers can learn from your research and how they should use it?
Yeah, so a data breach is defined somewhat differently by different states in terms of what's required for mandatory reporting. But a data breach is basically any time, could be a cybersecurity incident, could be a lost laptop with data, where a company is losing information about residents of some state. And you could define it more broadly to say consumers if you're focused on an organization and not the state laws. But I think the big message for me is that legislators should focus on maturing the field of cybersecurity policy with proper evaluation. It's not clear to me that we do know what works, as Thomas Vartanian said. I think there are many things that have been proposed, but since they've not been done, it's hard to know if that would make the difference, or if it'd be worth it on the cost side of slowing innovation. Except for TPRC and the workshop on the economics of information security, there's not a lot of empirical policy work being done. For policy evaluation, my dissertation and the research of Dr. Romanowski, who is on my committee, represent kind of some small efforts at good empirical work. Yet legislation, looks at this fast-moving technological landscape, and I think either feels an impulse to do nothing or to impulsively act. And I kind of ask, to what end? What goals are we trying to accomplish with new cybersecurity policy interventions? Many policy regulations are passed following some instigating breach, and the question afterwards: what would an adequate understanding of effective legislation be? Should it have stopped additional breaches? And so, using that as a standard of efficacy, my dissertation looked at state-level mandatory breach reporting to see if any regulations could bend the curve on data breaches. And looking at US cybersecurity-based policy interventions that had some degree of regulatory component on the companies, I found limited and potentially, temporary reductions in breaches in the case of the New York Department of Financial Services cybersecurity regulations. And so this is sort of overall, if you look across a decade time span, I saw approximately a 20% rate of growth year over year in growth of breaches at the state level. And with that sort of persistent rate of growth that isn't exponential, I think it gives us a chance to say, it's not clear that there's a lot of things we're doing that are working in the way we need them to. And so we shouldn't panic because it's not exponential. But we do need to think about what regulations are trying to accomplish and measure if they're actually accomplishing it.
Well, that's extremely helpful. And I would say your research, it appears to corroborate a number of other studies which are showing the increase of cyber attacks, their sophistication, the ways in which they're doing it, the types of infrastructures being targeted, and so forth. So I think your research is extremely timely. Something else that Ms. House had discussed was the international engagement and cooperation. So I'm sure that some of you have seen yesterday there was a summit between the US and Russia, and President Biden at his press conference, he had said his words to Mr. Putin were that certain critical infrastructure was off limits to attack. And he inferred these 16 critical infrastructures defined by Homeland Security and the recent ransomware attacks against Colonial and JBS, as we've referenced today. Now, apparently the two leaders have agreed that there'll be a task force of experts from both countries to work on a specific understanding of what's off limits and then how to address certain cases. So I'm curious to our panel, what do you think of this approach? And then how likely is it that a dialogue such as this will keep Russia from not attacking the US in future? Someone want to take a stab? Maybe just, okay, or Tom?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it, Roslyn.
Okay.
So, and the president put out an executive order on May 12th, which I thought was a good step, but again, highly repetitive of everything we've heard over the last 25 years. You could take his executive order and place it against President Clinton's, Bush's, Obama's, and Trump's executive orders, and they'd look pretty much the same. I did like the fact, however, that the executive order that President Biden put out had some reference to a sort of gold standard for coding and hardware and software production, which I think is long overdue. But let me talk about what came out of the discussions that you're referring to yesterday. So again, I would say that I view this with some skepticism, given what's happened over the last 25 years, and wonder if it's really going to result in anything in terms of hard progress in the cybersecurity field, or whether it's just more political cosmetics. And we'll find out over time whether or not that's so. But I mean, along with what you've said, I think you got to ask yourself several critical questions. First, does anybody believe that Russia doesn't know what is going on within its borders from the point of view of these cyber attacks that are happening? Second, does anyone think the gangs of cyber criminals exist in countries like Russia and North Korea and China, Iran, and that the governments don't know what's going on? Third, does anyone think that these countries will abandon, the veneer of plausible deniability that they've got right now because of the way this is happening? And lastly, does anyone honestly think that they're going to cooperate when they're winning the game? I mean, that's the problem. I mean, cybersecurity and cyberspace is the future of geopolitical conflict. And right now, we're back on our heels and they're winning the game. So you have to ask yourself, are they really going to be serious about coming to the table and actually engaging in a collegial sharing of information and sharing of enforcement power to try to stop? I sincerely doubt it.
Well, Josephine, I'd love to get you to weigh in on this because you are an expert at, looking at distribution of liability of damages for cyber attacks. And I'm sure that you've thought about this question and have something to say about yesterday's commentary.
So I think what was most striking to me about the announcement that came out of yesterday is it had a little bit the air of like the US and Russia are talking about this for the first time. And we're going to start from square one and begin consultations and see if we can figure out whether there are any boundaries. And I think for people who've been following this for a while, right? Russia, the United States, several other countries have been involved in this question of sort of should there be norms about what targets are not acceptable for targeting and what are the kind of applications of international law to cyberspace in the UNGGE and in other forums for more than a decade now. So I have to believe that it's always worth trying again, because I don't think that there's anything to be gained from saying that's it, no more engagement with Russia, there's just no point. But I also have to be a little bit skeptical that when we say, well, we're going to sit down and we're going to see if we can come up with a list of things we can agree to, that's going to be very productive, because it's been so unproductive in so many other forums for so long. I do think that the illusion of starting from scratch is a useful one sometimes. And I think sort of having a new administration and having everybody get the opportunity to pretend we've never had these conversations before sometimes means that people feel a little bit more free to take slightly new stances or change their minds about things that they've been somewhat intransigent in the past. I worry a lot about the question of could the Russian government agree not to target critical infrastructure, but also not cooperate in investigating people within their borders who do. I think that's a really important piece of this that certainly hasn't been discussed yet, or not discussed publicly yet, though I imagine it will be. And I think that it's pretty empty to sort of make these agreements without that part being really fully front and center of any of those discussions.
Well, it's interesting. When I heard those remarks, it was reminding me of 2015, President Obama in the Rose Garden with General Secretary Xi Jinping, and then making this announcement that they were going to end cyber attacks. And I think that was in the wake of OPM, but it has not ended by any means. But in any case, well, I think those are certainly we want to give the president credit for trying, and I think all the reports about the body language was that he was open, he was trying to have this dialogue. It was a fresh start, if you will, so we can at least give him the benefit of the doubt. So I'm going to turn to you, Tom, because I know you and your excellent work. You're writing for American Banker and The Hill, and you're certainly a skeptic of government, having worked in government yourself, or you are correct to point out the shortcomings, and I think that's very important. But I was also taken aback with the recent piece, which I thought was also thought-provoking, where you're actually calling for very specific government policies on cybersecurity, and that we have to have government intervention. So I hope you would maybe share with us, you talk about 5 things that we have to do to save the internet. Would you care to walk us through those?
Sure, Roslyn, and let me give you a little bit of background. In 1977, I was at the Office of the Control of the Currency, which regulates national banks in the United States. And we issued what I thought at that point was a seminal decision on technology. And it was a decision that allowed national banks to deploy ATMs, automated teller machines, which of course now seems to be sort of amateurish technology, but that was the height of technology. And then in the later 90s, when I was chair of the American Bar Association Cyberspace Committee, I traveled around the world and we put together a 20-country consortium to issue a paper on jurisdiction in cyberspace. And it became incredibly clear to me that perhaps we had made a mistake. Perhaps we had made a mistake in inventing the internet that we invented. And not only inventing it, but then piling on every inch of data and every ounce of financial value into it. So I started asking the question that I guess lawyers always ask when they're evaluating a problem, could we have done it differently? Should we do something different at this point? And that's when I started thinking about, and then research at the same time I was researching for my next book on cybersecurity and financial services. And it occurred to me that in large measure, we may have made some mistakes and we may be compounding them now by every step we take. So in this op-ed, I sort of threw out a few possibilities for discussion purposes, and maybe some of it was tongue-in-cheek, but I said, listen, the internet's broken. We need a new one. And maybe we should create a new. Financial services was always on a proprietary network up until 1994. 1994 is the genesis date for financial services companies to get online, offer online banking. And so I recommended 5 things. Number one, Congress and the administration have got to get serious about this and realize this is the issue of the moment. This is the existential issue of the moment because there's such an incredible nexus between economic security, cybersecurity, and democracy. We can't unhinge those things. And so we've got to figure out how to solve the problem. Second of all, anything of value should not be put on a network that is becoming increasingly insecure. And I don't care what expert you read, I think everybody will be, that we're creating insecurities faster than we're creating the solutions. Thirdly, and this is where I think the Biden administration was right on, hardware, coding, software, we've got to start making them meet certain security standards and before they are deployed, because it is unacceptable to have these security breaches and basically say, well, that's the price of being on the internet or in cyberspace. That shouldn't be the price. Fourthly, and this was sort of the ultimate point of the piece, let's consider building a new internet, an internet where you're not allowed on unless you have a license. You've got to have permission. And the license and that permission should include penalties, clear penalties, and a kill switch. Violate the rules of that internet. And lastly, like everything else, we need human and electronic cops. We've got artificial intelligence reaching enormous heights these days, and it's only going to get more and more sophisticated. We can use both human and electronic cops to survey and enforce what's going on the internet. There should be clear rules, clear responsibility, and clear enforcement. Computers, servers, networks, and jurisdictions where these kinds of malicious threats emanate from. And it seems to me, if a jurisdiction knows that if it doesn't police its own borders with respect to what's going on there in cyberspace, because it's going to be penalized, I think you'll get countries and nation states being a lot more serious about cybersecurity. So those are the 5 things that I threw out for discussion purposes. And interestingly enough, we've gotten a lot of feedback on it because I think people realize that we may have made a mistake.
So, well, thank you, Tom. I think that's quite a compelling a tall order, if you will. I mean, I think those are a lot of good points. Josephine, I want to turn to you because, you're a professor of cybersecurity. You are looking at also legal approaches, who bears responsibility. And you have obviously been studying policy. And, what's your sense about what's working and what isn't? And do you think some of these things, had we implemented them, might have averted some of these recent attacks we've experienced?
So I think there's a lot of interesting opportunity to make new rules around which stakeholders are responsible for what in cybersecurity, right? I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about internet service providers and what obligation or responsibility they should have to police malicious traffic on their networks, or to think about, as Thomas says, software and hardware manufacturers and what the standards should be for security. I think where I differ from Thomas's view, right, is that a lot of this, to my mind, really has to focus on the intermediary defenders, not on the question of sort of who's doing the malicious activity. Not because I think that should be ignored, and it certainly isn't being ignored, but because I think we have really very limited capacity to try and hold a lot of these bad actors accountable. And I think that sort of focusing on that and focusing on the idea that everybody else is just a victim and sort of should be treated as such has been somewhat detrimental. I think within the United States, the government agency that we've seen sort of kind of single-handedly take on all of the assignment of responsibilities, the Federal Trade Commission, which has done a certain amount of investigating cybersecurity and privacy incidents and trying to issue consent decrees and levy fines that will contribute to trying to assign some liability. But even that, I would say, is a pretty limited effort. It's a small agency. They do a lot of other things besides data security and privacy. There hasn't been enough effort on their part or on the entire government's part to sort of do that in a way that I think makes anybody feel it's a very serious threat. And I think part of that is that it's an effort that's very focused on who is sort of the central target of an incident, right? So if there's an incident involving a data breach from one company, the investigation is going to be that company, and not sort of who were all of the other providers of internet service, providers of hosting, providers of content delivery networks, whatever else, that could have played some role in security. So a lot of what I argue for is sort of how do we broaden our liability and our responsibility ecosystem here, and think about all of these different entities having some role they can play and what role they're best suited to play. I think that, to me, feels like a more productive direction than trying to kick whole countries off the internet. I think that's been sort of that, to be honest, in my mind, is exactly what the US government has been trying to say very explicitly we won't do, we don't have the authority to do, we don't run the internet in that way. I think you can view that as a mistake, and some people certainly do. The US trying to take a step back from its role in global internet governance. I think that's been probably the right strategic choice for the US in trying to maintain the internet as a global network and not leave people feeling like this is something where the US calls all of the shots.
So, well, thank you for that. I think that's a, so we have discussed now, a new internet, licenses, cops for the internet, meaningful intervention. It sounds like we have also, Josephine, you've talked about the holding the right actors accountable. Karl, I'm going to go to you. You are one of your areas of expertise is internet governance, and that is there at the Georgia Institute of Technology. You have a center for that. So I'm curious. I know that we get a lot of papers from your program looking at different aspects of this. This is one other thought, that there is something around engaging with other countries, that they cooperate. Do you have something to say about this?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot that can be done to reform the MLAT Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process. I think there's a lot more that could be done to improve international collaboration and shifting the focus more to certain cybercrime issues. I think that if you look at, for example, the executive order, it's very focused on demonstrating that the government can demonstrate what good cybersecurity practices look like, putting forward interesting new proposals like software bill of materials, a concept advanced by Dr. Alan Friedman, or zero trust architecture. I do think there were some interesting there's some interesting technological solutions that accompany certain policy and more collaborative either law enforcement or data sharing provisions between states. I think when I look at my research, which is sort of state and national interventions, there's a lot that can be done to synthesize some of those actions. Right now, so many compliance requirements put on businesses that experience data breach to report it to multiple nations, depending on the scope of their work. And it'd be interesting for future regulatory interventions and think about this burden that exists on companies already, and what can we do to reduce the burden while improving actual amount of transparency that's shared, and improving their cybersecurity posture in a way that is likely to reduce the overall number of breaches or their severity.
So, Josephine, I want to go back to you. Since we're talking about some big picture approaches or theories here, some of the other things discussed on more market-based ideas are, for example, cyber insurance. I have also read proposals around taxing internet traffic, so that, for example, you can't just send wanton emails. You actually have to pay for the traffic you send into the internet. That might reduce. Maybe the cost is just too low for a lot of attacks. But so, what is your sense of those things? As also, maybe that's part of the mix. Maybe you can share your thoughts.
I have a very hard time imagining a kind of sender pays model for email. I think that may be, that to me seems like one that you can't go back and re-engineer at this point. Maybe I'm thinking too small. But I don't think it's a productive economic model for thinking about kind of how people use the internet for non-malicious purposes. And right, Carl was just talking about how do you sort of try to reduce some of the burdens that are not productive, while also perhaps raising the responsibilities and the obligations that we think might make a real difference. I think that there's a lot of value for thinking about the economic dimensions of this that make this a less profitable endeavor for criminals. So I think thinking about sort of rules about not paying ransoms, thinking about rules or law enforcement activities that focus on the monetization stages of cybercrime, whether that's taking back those ransoms as we just saw happen, whether that's making it harder to sell stolen data on black market forums. I think all of that is extremely important and useful to be thinking about. How do we sort of make sure there's less money that fuels this industry? I'm less certain that the answer to that is charging everybody a lot more money to use the internet, because we already sort of, many of us spend a fair bit of money for internet access. I'm not sure that is where I see there being the most need to insert new barriers. And I also don't think that's where inserting new barriers is going to target criminals most effectively, right? That's going to target a lot of populations that are not criminals. And make it much harder for them to do very important things. So I do think it's important when we talk about some of these proposals to sort of think through those unintended consequences, right? Who suffers if we charge money?
But what about the cyber insurance angle?
Oh, cyber insurance. Thank you for reminding me.
Yes.
Yeah, so cyber insurance I think is really interesting. I do a lot of work on cyber insurance. I would say I like the idea a lot. I like the theory of we're going to sell insurance, as companies do, for covering all sorts of different costs, except for covering ransoms. I don't love that part of it. But I think the problem that I see most in cyber insurance is that it hasn't actually provided any risk mitigation, or hasn't provided much risk mitigation, that insurers don't know what to tell companies to do in order to prevent them from being breached in all of these different ways. And so it's helpful from a sort of loss spreading or risk pooling perspective. It helps some of the victims with compensation, but it hasn't raised the level of cybersecurity to my mind. And I think that would be what would make it a truly useful tool.
Thank you for that. Well, I'm pleased now to go to our second keynote. We have today Commissioner Brendan Carr of the Federal Communications Commission. Commissioner Carr has championed the modernization of infrastructure and the acceleration of high-speed network deployment, both of wireless and wireline technologies. He's crisscrossed the country to advocate for expanding America's telecommunications workforce through community colleges and apprenticeships, and he's led a groundbreaking telehealth initiative which proved vital during the pandemic. And next on his plate is improving the security of communications for all Americans. He has been working on this for a while. But it's fitting that he's joining us now, as the FCC this morning just voted unanimously, if I'm not mistaken, to proceed with a proposed rulemaking to secure America's communications supply chain through equipment authorization and competitive bidding. So Commissioner Carr, welcome, and please tell us about today's decision.
Well, thank you so much for the chance to join you. Very timely. I just got off our monthly FCC meeting, so I'll share with the group very briefly what it was that we voted on today. So as a lot of the viewers and listeners here know, the U.S. government for a number of years now has been taking a series of concrete steps designed to protect the security, the integrity of our communications networks, including cybersecurity efforts. One of the tactics that we've been taking is looking very closely at entities that are owned or controlled by the communist regime in China, Huawei, ZTE, other entities. And a couple of years ago, we started the process of removing insecure gear from our networks to the extent that that gear was purchased or funded through universal service dollars, so federal dollars. That action has made significant progress in securing our networks, but it doesn't go far enough. One of the things that it didn't do, for instance, is it expressly allowed entities to purchase the exact same gear from Huawei, ZTE, or others and insert it in the exact same place in the network, provided that they use private funds to do that, not federal dollars. And to me, that is a massive loophole that makes no sense. It is not the source of funding used to purchase these devices that pose a national security threat. It is their presence in the network. And so I've been pushing for the FCC to look at stopping the approval of any devices to be used regardless of funding. And the way we can do that is through our equipment authorization approval. So as you all probably know, if you've ever had a baby monitor or a TV remote control, on the back of it, there's an FCC seal. No device that emits RF energy is allowed to be lawfully sold or used in the US unless it goes through the FCC's equipment authorization process. So today we voted to propose and seek comment on a rule change that would say, if you've been put on what we call the covered entities list, which is where Huawei, ZTE, and 3 other entities are today. If you're on that list and so can't have federal dollars go to purchasing your equipment, then why should we approve that device or the equipment from you for use at all? And so today's vote by the FCC unanimously looks at seeking comment on doing just that. So I think that would be an important step forward. And I think it goes to show the bipartisan desire in Washington to advance the security of our network. So I'm excited about that. I think there's more to be done. I've also put out another idea that looks to use our equipment authorization process to view more closely entities whose supply chains originate in mainland China, including in the Xinjiang region. That is not part of our decision today, but I do think that's an important idea that we should keep in the forefront. So with that, happy to have a little chat as well.
Excellent. Well, so kind of you to join us so quickly and also to take some questions. I'm going to remind our audience, you are welcome to send your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them. So, but I'm going to start a question. I have the moderator's privilege. So what I want to say, Commissioner Carr, it's certainly encouraging to see the FCC act in this bipartisan fashion on such an important issue like security. I mean, clearly the American people, they're concerned about China's growing techno-militarism and they want our leaders to take action. Now, as you said, the FCC's covered list only notes these 5 entities. Now, this is a step in the right direction, but there are literally thousands of Chinese government and military firms operating in the United States today. And many of them produce devices which attach to our communication network, and they use the radio frequency as you described. I mean, this is even well-known entities like Lenovo and Lexmark, which have Chinese government ownership and military connections. They're restricted by the Defense Department. So what I'm curious is, in this rulemaking you're going to undertake, what methodology will the FCC use to identify the relevant companies? And will it amount to more than just sort of calling out certain firms which may be opportunistic or seem politically expedient?
Yeah, well, you're right. The threat certainly goes beyond these 5 entities. And also, sort of to your point, these 5 entities could play a bit of a shell game in terms of where they're, incorporate subsidiaries and whatnot. We need to be vigilant there. This particular proceeding is more about, once we have filled that bucket, that covered entities list with the right entities, how do we carry that decision through into our equipment authorization? But you're right, we should be taking a look broadly to make sure that that bucket of covered entities includes the full range of entities that are under the thumb of communist China and pose an unacceptable risk. And we need to be sensitive to the corporate structures as well that can be used to hide the influence of the communist regime by sort of laundering it, so to speak, through entities located in other countries. It's difficult. This isn't going to be the easiest thing in the world, but it is important enough that we should go down that path.
So, well, on that note, I'd like to ask you, just a follow-up question, because, before you were commissioner, you were general counsel at the FCC. So you are definitely one who knows the rules and regulations of the agency better than most. And it appears that this item is written to be well within the agency's authority. But as you well know, almost every time the FCC issues some kind of regulation, it will be challenged by the parties, may be brought to court. And, we'll see pushback from these entities. Even now, I think I was reading today, even Huawei doesn't like the premise that they are even being called out, despite all of the work that has been done for going back to 2005, demonstrating the concerns with this company. So, what do you plan? So I guess, are you anticipating the pushback, and how do you plan to address it? And what additional legal powers can be brought to the table to ensure that these rules stick if adopted?
Well, I'm shocked to learn that Huawei is not happy with us taking an appropriately tough approach to their insertion of this type of gear in our networks. The legal authority issue here is interesting. It's not one that I think is a significant hurdle. So the argument from their side could potentially go along the lines of the FCC's equipment authorization approval is a narrow grant of authority that we're only supposed to check for. Is there going to be interference with other frequencies? What's the power of this device going to be? So I anticipate that that's the argument that'll be made. It's not a persuasive point to me at this stage in our debate, at least. I find it hard to believe that a court would say, yes, FCC, you have determined that this gear poses an unacceptable national security risk. You've put it on the covered list because of that. You are ripping and replacing that gear out because of that risk, but you are compelled to continue to give your seal of approval and authorize that equipment in the U.S. I have a very, very difficult time seeing that that's an outcome that a court would reach. But there is also bipartisan, bicameral legislation in Congress right now that would, eliminate any possibility to even raise such an argument. In the Senate, Senator Markey and Senator Rubio have a bill that would direct the FCC to do exactly what we are proposing now. And on the House side, Steve Scalise and Congresswoman Eshoo have the companion legislation that would require us to do this. So again, I think, yes, there's going to be legal authority arguments. At this point, they're not very persuasive to me. And in any event, this legislation working its way through Congress could very well pass before we even reach the order phase of this proceeding.
Well, thank you for highlighting that, and it's great to see the bipartisanship. I'm going to, if you will stay for a moment for a question or two, we have one of our TPRC audience members. Thank you. I think been a presenter at our conference before, Divya Pathak, brings up a very good point, and I think one that you'll appreciate given all of your work on making broadband more available. And so, is there here a conflict between greater accessibility to internet technology and then the greater security concerns? And so how do you balance these things in your mind? And, sort of what is your leadership in the FCC going to look like? Because we are working very hard to get people online, everybody. We're insisting they get online on the one hand, but we're also putting them in harm's way, if you might say. Before you joined, we talked about all this.
Yeah, I mean, part of this question may go to and maybe I'm misreading it, but it could go to the concept of the reason why a lot of this Huawei and ZTE gear made its way into our networks, particularly in rural communities, was because of the price point of that gear compared to other gear. And so the ability to put cheap gear into the network, the theory would go increased access, because therefore people were able to build out and reach more communities with that. My response to that would be a couple-fold. One, there are new trend lines in the equipment space that are helping to drive down the cost of equipment and close that gap between what one vendor would be able to offer versus what an entity controlled by Communist China would be able to offer. One of those trends is this move towards ORAN, which means that you're doing a lot more of the work that used to take place with hardware at the software level. And so it's a lot potentially less expensive and more efficient to do it that way. The other answer I would give, of course, is that national security itself has a value, and not having a secure network has a cost. And so I think all of that nets out right. On the rip and replace side, we have congressional funding to help pay for that to offset the cost. So to the extent that the question was about that's sort of how I would respond. If I missed the thrust of it, I'm happy to take another run at it.
Okay, well, I also wanted to ask our panelists, they have also been studying the FCC closely over the years. Do any of you have any comments on this item or a question for Mr. Carr?
So I have a question. Given that part of the justification for the covered companies list is Chinese intelligence activity and Chinese laws that require, I believe this is true, obligate companies to cooperate with the Chinese national government, as well as technological either security flaws or other maybe cybersecurity specific concerns. What, if anything, could Chinese companies do to access U.S. markets to remove themselves from the covered companies list? Sorry, say that last piece again. What actions could they take to, if an entity is on the covered list today, how can they get off it? Or did I miss that? So the question is sort of, is this something that a Chinese company is capable of being removed from, given sufficient completion of, meeting certain regulatory standards? Or is this something that the Chinese state is bringing on its own companies and they're incapable of demonstrating sufficient compliance to overcome?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's impossible to get off of the covered list. I mean, it is based on an assessment. One, as you noted, of sort of general background principles of law in China, including that national security law that requires virtually any entity upon request to provide information to the communist regime. That is something that would not be unique to any entity, and obviously would not necessarily go away almost regardless of what any one entity did. But there's other features that we look at when putting entities on this list that are unique to the individual entities, and so those considerations are things that could be mitigated. Do I anticipate that level of mitigation taking place? I don't, and part of it is the continued gap between what the FCC and our national security agencies sort of perceive and see in these entities and what these entities themselves sort of say and sort of put forward. There's still a pretty big gap in terms of where we are in terms of views of relative risk. So I would say a hard time for that gap to close, but I would not say it's impossible for things to change sufficiently to get an entity off the list.
So, well, we are coming to the end of our time. I want to just close with a lightning round question and even include you, Commissioner Carr. So I'll ask you last, but my question for our panel today is, if you have to identify 1 to 2 issues that we need to put on the telecommunications policy agenda, what would they be? And you're also free to highlight your own research as well, but please think of 2 issues that we want the TPRC community to look at, that policymakers need to look at, that policymakers need to fund, that they need to pay attention to. What are the 2 key issues? Karl, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so given my own research and I think the work of TPRC and the fact that it's relevant to legislators and regulators as well, I would put forward transparent metrics as one and policy evaluation as another important step in the policy process that needs to be included when we consider new regulations.
Great. Josephine, 2 issues.
I think I'm going to come back to banning ransoms and thinking about whether there should be requirements for ISPs to mitigate botnets.
Excellent. Tom?
Yeah, Roslyn, I think two issues, and we've sort of touched on these a little bit. One is how we begin to elevate security over innovation, or at least put them on an equal setting. Because now innovation, you can't read a government report over the last 25 years and not read the word innovation hundreds of times in that report, and the word security maybe 5 or 6 times, right? So we've got to change that balance somewhere along the line so that we make sure that innovation doesn't overwhelm security in terms of coming to market with kinds of products that are coming. The second thing I would propose is how we change our deterrence and defense in cyberspace from an every person for itself or every company for itself to something broader. And what I mean by that is, and since I'm an expert in the financial services business, I'll use that as an example. And essentially what we have now is every major financial institution is out there defending itself, right? Its defense is within the 4 corners of its building. Well, if you compare that to military defense, that's like saying to JP Morgan, to Jamie Dimon, listen, you have to defend your square block in Manhattan, so you better go out and get ballistic missiles to do that. Well, that doesn't make any sense. We would never think about that militarily. Why are we doing that from a cybersecurity point of view? And what are the alternatives to change that so that we have a better deterrence defense system between government and private sector, rather than the two parties just staring at each other and getting nowhere?
Commissioner Carr.
Yeah, I'll do the typical government official thing, and I'll answer a different question, or maybe I'll give it 3 types of answers. One generic, and then two specific. You know, one is in the physical threat space. When we're responding to physical threats, take the White House for instance. We have a room called the Situation Room, and it's one room. It's not these situation rooms. And so I think we need to carry that concept forward in the cyberspace, which is to make sure we have one table, and all the entities should be sitting at that table. But we don't want different components of the federal government setting up their own, situation rooms and not talking to each other. So I think for the FCC, for instance, a lot of this activity should be taking place at DHS. It should be their table. We should have a seat at their table. The other thing that I'll say is, just specific to the proceedings that I've been talking about. One is, we need to move quickly to close out this proceeding on addressing the Huawei loophole. And then 2, I think we should launch a proceeding at the FCC to take a closer look at the use of slave labor in China in our technology supply chains.
Well, I want to thank our excellent panelists for the discussion today, Commissioner Carr and Carole House from the National Security Council, and to our many attendees for joining. Thank you to our sponsors for making our event possible today. For everybody, our annual conference, the 49th TPRC conference, will be held online September 22 through 24th. Early bird registration is available through August 31st. We have a cybersecurity track already with some 20 papers of new research on these critical policy issues. And you can find an archive of today's event at tprcweb.com. You can also find the listing of the papers that'll be presented and the posters. So please check that out and join us. And our next webinar is going to be July 7th. It's the 3rd Thursday on July 17. I'm not exactly sure, but please check our website and join us for that. And I want to thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Thank you.